After my grandparents died in a sudden plane crash, the family lawyer revealed a secret that turned my blood to ice. I was the sole heir to a $100 million estate. My greedy family demanded I hand it over immediately, and when I refused, they showed up the very next day with armed guards to evict me from my grandfather's lake house. But they froze in pure terror when they saw exactly who was standing right beside me on the porch. My name is Fiona, and I am 33 years old. I work as a senior luxury asset appraiser in New York. If you have ever had your own flesh and blood try to destroy your life out of pure greed, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe because you will want to see exactly how I destroyed their entire world with one single phone call. The funeral for my grandfather Charles and my grandmother Beatrice had ended exactly 3 hours ago. I was sitting alone in the massive living room of their $15 million Crystal Lake villa, staring at the roaring fireplace. My fingers tightly gripped my grandfather's antique gold pocket watch, the only thing recovered from the crash site. The heavy oak front doors flew open with a violent crash that echoed through the vaulted ceilings. I did not even flinch. I knew exactly who it was. My older brother Brad stormed into the room, followed closely by my younger sister Amber and her husband Malik Jones. Malik was a slick, high-powered African-American real estate lawyer from Atlanta, wearing a custom Tom Ford suit and a smug smile. They were not wearing black. They were not grieving. They looked like predators who had just cornered a wounded animal. Brad marched straight up to my chair and smacked my hand, causing my grandfather's pocket watch to clatter onto the stone hearth. "Time is up for playing the squatter, Fiona." He barked, his face red with aggression. "Pack your cheap bags and get out of this villa before I call the police and have you dragged out in handcuffs." Before I could even lean down to retrieve the watch, Malik stepped forward. He moved with the extreme arrogance of a man who thought he held all the cards. He dropped a thick leather-bound folder directly onto the coffee table, shattering my porcelain teacup. The hot liquid spilled everywhere, but Malik just adjusted his gold Rolex with a calm, calculated motion. "Let me translate this into simple terms for you, Fiona, since you do not understand corporate law," Malik said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is an emergency quit notice stamped and approved by the county judge an hour ago. Under the temporary inheritance clauses, Brad is now the acting executor of the Campbell family estate and the newly appointed head of the family business. This lake house has already been registered as collateral for a massive emergency corporate loan. You hold no position on the board of directors. You have absolutely no legal standing to be on this property." I stared at the red stamp on the paperwork. My mind raced, analyzing every single word Malik had just said. As a luxury asset appraiser, my entire career was built on spotting discrepancies and noticing the tiny details that other people missed. A sudden icy realization washed over me. You do not get a county judge to approve an emergency eviction and register a $15 million property as corporate collateral just 3 hours after a funeral. The paperwork, the legal loopholes, the filings, all of this had to have been prepared months in advance. Malik and Brad had orchestrated this hostile takeover long before my grandfather's plane ever fell out of the sky. Amber crossed her arms and looked me up and down with absolute disgust. "God, you look pathetic," Amber sneered. "Are you really wearing a discount rack blazer to sit in a $15 million estate? You do not belong here, Fiona. You have never belonged here." She paced around the room, running her manicured fingers over the antique mahogany furniture with clear, greedy intentions. "Do you really think Grandpa wanted a glorified inventory clerk inheriting this house?" Amber laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that bounced off the high walls. "Mom and Dad let you drown in $120,000 of student loans at NYU because your appraiser degree was a useless joke. Meanwhile, Brad was actually doing real work. They funded Brad's hedge funds with millions because he is the true heir. You are just the family disappointment who counts other people's furniture for a living." I remained completely silent, letting her vicious words hang in the air. The truth was, my family had financially abandoned me the moment I refused to be their compliant puppet. They threw millions at Brad's failing Wall Street ventures while I worked 3 grueling jobs to pay off my student debt. But my absolute silence only seemed to enrage Brad further. He kicked the shattered pieces of my teacup across the expensive Persian rug. "You are a failed middle child," Brad screamed, stepping so close I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "You have zero right to this $100 million empire. You are going to sign this property handover agreement right now and walk out that door." Brad pulled a heavy fountain pen from his jacket pocket and slammed it onto the legal documents. The aggressive crack of metal against the glass table made Amber jump, but I just kept my eyes locked on Brad's panicked, sweating face. He was trying to look intimidating, but my professional training taught me how to read people under extreme pressure. Brad was terrified. There was a desperate, frantic undertone beneath his screaming. He was not acting like a man who just inherited a fortune. He was acting like a man running out of time. Malik stepped closer, leaning over the table to box me in. His voice dropped to a low, threatening whisper. "I am not going to ask you twice, Fiona. You are going to pick up that pen and sign away your occupancy rights. If you refuse, I will activate the enforcement clause on this document. At exactly 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, my private security team and the county sheriff will kick that front door off its hinges. We will drag you out by your hair, throw your garbage bags onto the street, and do it right in front of the local news cameras. You will be publicly humiliated and legally ruined. Sign the paper right now." The heavy silence in the room was suddenly broken by the soft click of designer heels against the hardwood floor. My mother Priscilla stepped out from the grand hallway, dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a silk monogrammed handkerchief. She had clearly been waiting in the wings, letting the men play the role of aggressive enforcers before sweeping in to play the devastated matriarch. She wore a black cashmere morning dress that looked more suited for a fashion runway than a funeral. She glided past Brad and Malik, intentionally ignoring the shattered porcelain and spilled tea on her expensive rug. "Fiona, please listen to your brother," my mother said, her voice dripping with artificial maternal warmth. She sat down on the leather sofa right next to me, reaching out to grab my hand. Her fingers felt cold and rigid, like a vice masquerading as an embrace. "You have always been so stubborn, but this is not the time for your usual rebellion. Brad is in a terrible bind in New York. The real estate market has been unforgiving, and his investment portfolios took a massive hit. If we do not liquidate this property immediately, the Campbell family will face complete financial ruin. We will lose the country club memberships, the cars, our entire way of life. Be a good daughter for once, Fiona. Sacrifice for the family so your brother can survive." I stared down at her perfectly manicured hand clutching mine. A profound, sickening realization settled deep in my chest. She was not grieving the loss of my grandfather, who had built the very fortune she was currently wearing. She was grieving the potential loss of her social status. To her, my entire existence was nothing more than an insurance policy, a sacrificial lamb meant to be slaughtered the moment her golden boy made a financial mistake. I slowly, deliberately pulled my hand away from her grasp. The last remaining shred of familial love I held for this woman withered and died in that exact second, leaving behind nothing but absolute cold precision. While my mother tried to regain her composure, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Brad had pulled Malik toward the large bay windows overlooking the lake. They thought they were far enough away to speak privately, but the vaulted ceilings of the villa carried their hushed, frantic whispers straight to my trained ears. As a luxury asset appraiser, I made my living listening to wealthy clients try to hide their financial disasters. I knew panic when I heard it. "We need her signature today," Malik hissed, his slick facade cracking for just a fraction of a second. "The offshore accounts in the Caymans are completely dry, Brad. The IRS auditors are breathing down my neck. If we cannot show a $15 million asset injection by the end of the fiscal quarter tomorrow, the federal investigators are going to open a full inquiry into the Wilson Group Trust Fund." Brad ran his trembling hands through his hair, pacing like a trapped rat. I know," he whispered back, his voice tight with genuine terror. "But the hedge fund margins collapsed. We have a $40 million deficit, Malik. If this lake house does not clear escrow by Friday morning, we are not just going bankrupt. We are going to federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement. I cannot go to prison, Malik. You promised me this emergency eviction loophole would work. I sat perfectly still, absorbing every single word of their secret confession. The puzzle pieces locked together with horrifying clarity. This was never about temporary corporate loans or sibling rivalry. Brad and Malik had been systematically embezzling tens of millions of dollars from the family trust. They had drained the offshore accounts and left a massive gaping hole in the company finances. The federal government was already closing in on them. My grandfather's beloved lake house was their final desperate lifeline. They needed to steal my home to cover up their federal crimes. Fiona, are you even listening to me? My mother snapped, her voice losing its fake, sweet tone. Stop being so selfish. Sign the paper so we can all move on from this tragedy. I stood up slowly, towering over my mother. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not give them the satisfaction of an emotional breakdown. I reached out and picked up the heavy legal document Malik had slammed onto the table. The emergency quit notice with its bright red county stamp felt heavy in my hands. Brad and Malik stopped their whispering and turned around, expecting to see me finally surrender. Malik crossed his arms, a triumphant sneer returning to his face. Smart girl, Malik said, stepping forward to hand me the fountain pen. You finally realize you have no way out. I looked at Malik, then at Brad, and finally at my mother. I turned on my heel, walked directly over to the massive stone fireplace, and casually tossed the legally stamped emergency quit notice straight into the roaring flames. The paper caught fire instantly, curling and blackening as the bright orange fire consumed it. The room plunged into absolute stunned silence. No one moved. No one breathed. The only sound was the crackle of burning paper, turning their fraudulent legal trap into worthless gray ash. Are you out of your mind? Brad exploded, the veins in his neck bulging as he lunged forward. He looked like he wanted to physically attack me, but Malik grabbed his arm, pulling him back. You stupid, arrogant failure! Amber shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. Do you have any idea what you just did? You just sealed your own fate, Fiona, Malik growled, his eyes dark with absolute fury. You think burning a piece of paper stops me? I have digital copies. I have the county sheriff on speed dial. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, you are going to be ripped out of this house by armed men. I will make sure they drag you through the dirt. I will destroy your career, your reputation, and your life. I turned my back on the fire and faced the 4 people who shared my blood, but possessed none of my loyalty. I felt no fear. I only felt the icy calm of a predator watching its prey step willingly into a snare. I will not be going anywhere. I said, my voice dangerously quiet and perfectly steady. This house belongs to me. And if I were you, I would stop worrying about kicking me out and start worrying about what happens to you when the sun comes up tomorrow. I walked past them without looking back. I headed straight for the grand staircase, leaving them standing in the center of the living room, paralyzed by their own rising panic. I could hear Brad kicking another piece of furniture as Amber yelled at my mother to do something. Their chaotic, violent energy meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. They had declared war, but they had no idea who they were actually fighting. They thought I was just an inventory clerk. They had no idea I was the only person who knew about the biometric safe hidden in my grandfather's underground wine cellar. And they had no idea what kind of weapons he had left behind for me to use against them. I stood at the top of the grand staircase, hidden in the shadows of the second-floor landing. Down below, I could hear the heavy front doors slam shut, followed by the aggressive screech of tires as Malik sped his luxury SUV down the gravel driveway. They were gone for now, but I knew exactly what they were planning. They thought I was upstairs crying into my pillow, paralyzed by the threat of an armed eviction. They believed they had successfully terrorized the weak middle child into submission. They could not have been more wrong. I waited until the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 1 in the morning. The massive lake house was entirely silent, except for the wind howling off the dark water outside. I changed out of my funeral attire into a black turtleneck and slacks. It was time to go to work. I bypassed the main living areas and headed straight for the basement staircase. My grandfather Charles was a man of exquisite taste and immense secrets. He had built an underground wine cellar that held thousands of rare vintages, but its true purpose was entirely different. I walked past rows of expensive Bordeaux and reached the damp stone of the back wall. There was a specific mahogany rack holding bottles of Pinot Noir from the exact year my grandparents were married. I reached out and pulled the third bottle from the left. There was a soft, mechanical click. The entire heavy wooden rack unlatched, allowing me to swing it open like a vault door. Behind the rack sat a flush steel panel embedded directly into the concrete foundation. It had no keypad and no combination dial. It was a highly classified biometric safe, equipped with a high-resolution retina scanner and a fingerprint reader. Grandpa Charles had installed this 3 years ago. He never programmed my mother's fingerprints into it. He never registered Brad or Amber. He only trusted one person in the entire Campbell bloodline because I was the only one who had never asked him for a dime. I leaned forward, pressing my right eye to the scanner while placing my thumb on the glowing glass pad. The machine whirred, scanning my biometrics with a sharp red laser. A mechanical voice chimed softly, confirming my identity. The heavy steel door popped open with a rush of pressurized air. Inside, there was no cash. There were no gold bars or fancy jewelry. My grandfather knew that true power was not in physical wealth, but in information. Resting on the cold steel shelf was a thick black leather dossier and a military-grade encrypted external hard drive. Stamped on the front of the leather folder in gold lettering were 2 words: Project Reset. I grabbed the drive and the folder, closed the safe, and hurried back upstairs to my grandfather's private study. I locked the heavy oak doors behind me and booted up my laptop. My hands were perfectly steady. The emotional shock of the funeral and my family's betrayal had completely evaporated, leaving behind the sharp, analytical mind of a senior asset appraiser. I plugged the encrypted drive into my computer. A password prompt appeared on the screen. I did not have to guess. I typed in the serial number of the antique pocket watch Brad had so arrogantly knocked to the floor earlier that day. The encryption dissolved and dozens of highly organized folders appeared on my screen. I opened the first folder, titled Internal Audit. What I saw made my blood run cold. My grandfather had secretly hired private forensic accountants to track every single cent moving through the family trust over the past 2 years. The spreadsheets painted a picture of absolute financial devastation. Malik and Brad had been running a sophisticated embezzlement ring right under the board of directors' noses. I clicked through the offshore banking ledgers, analyzing the data with clinical precision. Malik had set up 6 different shell companies in the Cayman Islands. He had been forging my grandfather's signature on corporate loan documents, funneling millions of dollars out of the company's operating budget and straight into high-risk hedge funds managed by Brad. But Brad was an incompetent trader. The hedge funds had completely collapsed, taking $40 million of the family's money down with them. The next document was a warning letter from the Internal Revenue Service. The federal government was already auditing the corporate group for tax evasion. Malik and Brad were trapped. They needed to replace the missing $40 million before the federal auditors realized the accounts were empty. That was why they needed this $15 million lake house so desperately. They planned to leverage it, sell it to a private buyer, and use the cash to desperately plug the gaping hole in their offshore accounts before the federal authorities caught on. I opened the leather dossier and found physical copies of wire transfers bearing Malik's signature. He had authorized the movement of stolen funds to his own private accounts in Atlanta, essentially robbing his own brother-in-law while helping him cover up the massive corporate deficit. The sheer arrogance of their crimes was staggering. They were not just greedy siblings trying to bully me out of an inheritance. They were desperate, cornered criminals facing decades in federal prison. Malik's threat to have me dragged out by armed guards tomorrow morning was not a bluff. It was a panicked attempt to save his own life and preserve his freedom. I leaned back in the leather office chair, the glow of the computer screen illuminating the dark room. They thought I was an uneducated inventory clerk who would crumble under the threat of a fake eviction notice. They had entirely underestimated my expertise. As a luxury asset appraiser, I destroyed fraudulent financial claims for a living. I dealt with billionaires trying to hide their assets, and I knew exactly how to dismantle a fake legal document. I checked my watch. It was 2 in the morning. I had exactly 7 hours before Malik and his private security team arrived to kick down my front door. It was plenty of time to set a trap they could never escape. I reached into the leather dossier and pulled out a single thick cardstock envelope. Inside was a black card with nothing but a 10-digit phone number printed in embossed silver ink. There was no name attached to it, but my grandfather had left a handwritten sticky note on the back. It simply read, "Federal Prosecutor, Eastern District. Use only when the wolves break down the door." I picked up my cell phone and dialed the number. The line did not ring. It connected immediately with a sharp electronic click. A man answered with a deep, gravelly voice that carried absolute authority. "State your clearance code," the voice demanded. I did not hesitate. "Charles Campbell, Irrevocable Trust Priority Access. Fiona." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. The sound of rapid typing echoed faintly through the receiver. When the man spoke again, his tone shifted from bureaucratic to deadly serious. "Ms. Campbell," he said, "your grandfather told me I would be receiving this call. My team has been monitoring the Wilson Group offshore accounts for 18 months, waiting for the perpetrators to make a fatal mistake. Tell me they made it." "They did more than make a mistake," I replied, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "They just handed us their own execution warrant. Malik Jones and Brad Campbell have illegally leveraged this estate. They forged an emergency eviction notice and planned to physically remove me from the premises at 9 o'clock this morning using armed private security. They are attempting to liquidate the property to cover their $40 million deficit before your fiscal audit begins tomorrow." The prosecutor let out a low, sharp breath. A fraudulent eviction using armed contractors on a federally protected witness property. That elevates this from corporate embezzlement to a severe federal crime. "Can you confirm Malik Jones will be on site? He will be leading the charge I confirmed. He wants to drag me out into the street to satisfy his own ego. He believes he has outsmarted the entire system." The prosecutor chuckled, but there was absolutely no humor in the sound. "I will have a specialized tactical unit deployed to your location by 8:45, he stated. "We will remain out of sight until they breach the property line and initiate the illegal eviction. The trap needs to snap shut while they are actively committing the felony. I will see you in a few hours, Ms. Campbell." The line went dead. I set the phone down on the mahogany desk, feeling a profound sense of finality. The financial trap was fully armed and ready to detonate. I turned my attention back to the laptop screen, intending to safely eject the encrypted hard drive. But as I moved the mouse cursor, my eyes caught the very last folder at the bottom of the directory. It was labeled Flight 404. My blood froze in my veins. That was the exact tail number of my grandfather's private jet. The same jet that had plummeted into a remote mountainous region just days ago, killing both him and my grandmother instantly. My hand trembled for the first time that night as I double-clicked the folder. I expected to find maintenance logs or flight itineraries. Instead, a single high-resolution scanned document appeared on the screen. It was a wire transfer confirmation from an untraceable banking institution in the Cayman Islands. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted financial codes. The sender was listed as Apex Holdings, LLC, which I had just identified in the previous folder as one of Malik's illegal shell companies. The transfer amount was exactly $250,000. But it was the recipient and the date that made my heart stop beating entirely. The money had been wired directly into the personal account of the lead aviation mechanic responsible for servicing my grandfather's jet. The date stamp on the clearance receipt was a Tuesday, exactly 48 hours before the fatal crash. I stared at the digital receipt as the horrifying reality crashed over me like a physical blow. The plane crash was not a tragic accident caused by sudden mechanical failure. My grandfather had not died because of bad weather or a faulty engine. He was murdered. My own brother and his greedy lawyer husband had paid a mechanic $250,000 to sabotage the aircraft. They had assassinated my grandparents in cold blood, just to accelerate the inheritance process and cover up their massive financial crimes before the federal audit could ruin them. A wave of intense nausea hit me so hard I had to grip the edges of the desk to keep from falling out of the chair. The room seemed to spin. I closed my eyes, seeing the image of my grandmother's warm smile and my grandfather's firm, protective hands. They had been slaughtered by the very people they had fed, clothed, and sheltered. My mother Priscilla had begged me to sacrifice for the family. She had asked me to save the brother who had literally orchestrated the violent deaths of her own parents. The sickness in my stomach rapidly burned away, replaced by a towering infernal rage. This was no longer just about protecting my home or defending my grandfather's legacy. This was about absolute total destruction. I stood up from the desk, my chair rolling back and hitting the bookshelf. I walked over to the large bay window and looked out at the dark waters of Crystal Lake. The sun was just beginning to turn the eastern horizon a pale, bruised purple. In a few hours, Malik, Brad, and Amber would drive up to this house thinking they were the apex predators. They thought they were coming to bully a helpless woman out of her inheritance. They had no idea they were walking straight into a federal staging ground. I tightened my grip on my grandfather's ceramic coffee mug, my knuckles turning white. They wanted to play a ruthless game of power and intimidation. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. I was going to let them step onto this porch, let them taste their victory for one fleeting second, and then I was going to bury them so deep under federal charges they would never see the sun again. At exactly 8:45, the tranquil morning silence of Crystal Lake was violently shattered. The aggressive crunch of heavy tires tearing up the crushed stone driveway echoed through the property. I stood in the expansive chef's kitchen, methodically pouring dark roast coffee into my grandfather's favorite ceramic mug. I was dressed in a razor-sharp charcoal-tailored suit, the exact kind of armor I wore when dismantling fraudulent billionaires in Manhattan boardrooms. Today I was wearing it to dismantle my own bloodline. The convoy tore through the open wrought iron gates without slowing down. Two massive black tactical SUVs flanked a large commercial moving truck. They parked haphazardly across the manicured front lawn, completely destroying the expensive landscaping my grandmother had meticulously curated for a decade. The message they were sending was painfully clear. They believed they owned this place now, and they were going to do whatever they wanted with it, regardless of the destruction they left in their wake. Malik Jones emerged first from the lead SUV, adjusting his designer tie and holding his leather briefcase like a weapon. Brad stepped out next, his face flushed with the manic, frantic energy of a man who believed he had just escaped a $40 million federal guillotine. Amber strutted out from the passenger side, holding an expensive iced coffee and typing rapidly on her phone, probably updating her social media followers about her newly acquired lakefront estate. Finally, my mother Priscilla stepped out of the second vehicle. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses and a fur-trimmed coat, looking every bit the triumphant matriarch ready to claim her stolen throne. The back doors of the SUVs swung open and four massive men stepped onto the gravel. They were private security contractors dressed in tactical gear with heavy boots and holstered weapons. Malik had not hired regular movers to pack my things. He had hired mercenaries to ensure I was physically humiliated and violently removed from the premises. He wanted to break me. Brad pointed a shaking, sweaty finger at the heavy oak front doors of the villa. "Go in there and drag her out." Brad barked at the lead contractor, his voice cracking with unhinged aggression. "I do not care if she is crying or screaming. If she locked the door, break it off its hinges. Throw her cheap bags into the dirt and toss her out onto the street. If she resists, you have my full authorization to restrain her with force." Malik walked up beside Brad, patting him on the shoulder with a sickeningly smug grin. "Relax, Brad," Malik said smoothly, pulling the fraudulent county eviction notice from his briefcase and waving it in the crisp morning air. "We are doing this perfectly by the book. She has had her 24 hours. She is officially a hostile trespasser on corporate property. The local sheriff is already processing the paperwork downtown. This house is ours, and her little rebellion is over. Amber laughed loudly, snapping a photo of the moving truck parked on the ruined grass. Make sure they sanitize the guest room before I move my stuff in. Amber sneered loud enough for her voice to carry. I do not want to catch whatever loser disease Fiona carries. Priscilla just sighed dramatically, adjusting her sunglasses against the morning glare. Just get it over with quickly, boys, Priscilla commanded the guards, waving her manicured hand dismissively. I have an interior designer arriving at noon to remodel the dining room, and I do not want Fiona's dramatic crying ruining my aesthetic vision. Let us just take out the trash so we can celebrate your brother's new promotion. I watched their entire pathetic performance through the tinted glass of the foyer window. My heart rate was a steady resting 60 beats per minute. I felt absolutely no fear. I felt nothing but the cold, clinical precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel over a terminal tumor. They thought they had secured their victory. They thought they were the apex predators. They had absolutely no idea that the thick pine forest surrounding the property was currently hiding 24 heavily armed federal tactical agents. They had no idea that a federal sniper was already tracking Brad's chest from a hidden vantage point across the lake. The trap was perfectly set, and they had marched right into the center of it with arrogant smiles on their faces. The four armed contractors marched up the stone steps of the front porch, their heavy boots thudding ominously against the wood. The lead guard reached out a massive hand to grab the brass handle of the front door. Before his fingers could even make contact, I turned the deadbolt and pulled the heavy oak doors smoothly open from the inside. I stepped out onto the expansive wraparound porch, the crisp morning wind catching the edges of my charcoal suit. I did not look scared. I did not look like a defeated squatter begging for mercy. I raised my grandfather's ceramic mug to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of black coffee. The steam curled into the cold air as I looked down at the men standing on my property. The lead security contractor froze, his hands still hovering in the air. He was used to dealing with panicked, weeping tenants who had nowhere else to go. He was entirely unprepared for a woman who looked at him with the absolute authority of someone holding all the cards. Down on the gravel driveway, the cruel laughter died in Amber's throat. Brad's manic smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Malik tightened his grip on his briefcase, his eyes narrowing as he tried to process my complete lack of panic. "Time is up," Fiona Malik shouted, breaking the sudden heavy silence. His voice carried across the lawn, trying desperately to reassert his dominance over the situation. "I told you I was not playing games. You missed the 9 o'clock deadline. You are now illegally trespassing on Wilson Group assets." "Grab her," Malik ordered the guards, pointing a sharp finger at me. "Put her in cuffs if she fights back." I took another slow sip of my coffee, my eyes locking directly onto Malik's. I did not raise my voice, but the icy, absolute certainty in my tone cut through the morning air like a razor blade. "I would strongly advise your hired muscle to take a step back, Malik," I stated calmly, lowering the mug. "Because if any of these men take one more step onto this porch, they will be committing a federal crime. And unlike your fake county eviction notice, the people waiting in the tree line actually have the authority to pull the trigger." Malik threw his head back and let out a sharp, patronizing laugh. "Federal crime," he mocked, shaking his head. "Are you completely out of your mind, Fiona? You are a desperate squatter making up invisible snipers in the woods to save your own skin." He turned to the lead security contractor with a look of absolute disdain. "Ignore her delusional threats. Grab her by the arms and drag her off this property right now. I am paying you to do a job." Brad stepped forward, the gravel crunching violently under his expensive loafers. "You are pathetic, Fiona," Brad screamed, his voice echoing across the misty lake. "You think you can bluff us with fake police? There is nobody in those woods. Break the door down and throw her out onto the street." The massive lead guard grunted and took one heavy step onto the top stair of the porch, reaching his thick-gloved hand toward my shoulder. He never made contact. The heavy oak door behind me swung open completely. Stepping out from the shadows of the grand foyer was a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a reinforced dark tactical vest. Emblazoned across his chest in bold yellow letters were the words, U.S. Marshal. A gleaming silver federal star hung prominently from his belt. "I strongly suggest you keep your hands to yourself, son," the marshal said, his voice carrying the calm, lethal weight of the United States federal government. "Unless you want to spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary for assaulting a protected witness." At his exact words, the tree line surrounding the villa seemed to come alive. From behind the ancient pine trees, from the edge of the private boat dock, and from the blind corners of the wraparound porch, a dozen heavily armed tactical agents stepped into the morning sunlight. They moved with absolute military precision, raising their matte black rifles and locking their stances. Two distinct bright red laser sights materialized directly on the center of Brad's chest. Another red dot rested precisely over Malik's designer silk tie. The terrifying reality of the situation crashed down on the driveway with the force of an avalanche. The private security contractors were not fools. They were hired muscle-paid to intimidate unarmed civilians, not to engage in a shootout with federal agents. The lead guard looked at the marshal, looked at the red laser sights, and immediately dropped his tactical baton onto the wooden porch. He raised both hands high above his head, stepping backward down the stairs. The other three guards instantly followed suit, dropping their equipment and dropping to their knees on the gravel, showing their empty palms to the tactical team. The triumphant smirk melted off Malik's face, replaced by a sickening, pale horror. Amber dropped her expensive iced coffee. It shattered on the driveway, splashing brown liquid over her designer shoes, but she did not even blink. She was staring at the tactical agents in pure, unadulterated terror. Priscilla grabbed Brad's arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into his suit jacket. Brad's mouth hung open, his manic energy completely evaporating into suffocating panic. Malik was a cornered rat, but he was still a lawyer. He tried to rely on his usual weapon of loud intimidation to regain control. "Now hold on a minute," Malik stammered, his voice shaking as he waved the fraudulent county document in the air. "There is a massive misunderstanding here, officer. I am a licensed real estate attorney. This is my brother-in-law's legal property. I have a court-ordered emergency eviction notice signed by a county judge. This woman is a hostile trespasser. You have no jurisdiction to interfere with a civil county eviction." The U.S. Marshal stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with me on the porch. He did not even look at the piece of paper Malik was desperately waving around. He looked at Malik with absolute disgust. "I do not care about your fabricated county paperwork, counselor," the marshal stated. "You are currently trespassing on federal ground." I took another slow sip of my coffee, letting the bitter liquid warm my throat before I delivered the final legal annihilation. "Your emergency quit notice is completely invalid, Malik," I stated, projecting my voice so it rang out across the lawn. "You tried to leverage this estate as collateral for the corporate trust, but you failed to realize one vital detail. My grandfather Charles was infinitely smarter than you. He never placed this $15 million villa into the corporate portfolio. He placed it into a blind, irrevocable trust. A trust that bypassed the board of directors completely and named me as the sole legal beneficiary. Ownership of this estate was fully and permanently transferred into my name 48 hours ago." Brad shook his head violently, his eyes darting between the red laser sight glowing on his chest and my face. "No," Brad shouted, his voice cracking. "That is a lie. The offshore accounts need this house. You cannot own it, Fiona. You are just an appraiser." "She is the sole legal owner of this estate," the U.S. Marshal confirmed, his hand resting casually on his holstered weapon. "And as of 2:00 this morning, Fiona Campbell is officially under the protection of the United States Marshals Service as a primary cooperating witness in an ongoing federal grand jury investigation. By stepping onto this property and attempting to forcibly remove a protected witness, you have just committed a Class A federal felony." The leather folder dropped from Malik's trembling hand. The fraudulent eviction notice scattered across the wet gravel, blowing away in the morning breeze. His brilliant legal trap had not just failed, it had actively triggered his own destruction. He looked at the armed agents surrounding his luxury vehicles and realized there was no exit. He could not talk his way out of this. He could not sue his way out of this. He had brought a fake piece of paper to a federal gunfight. Priscilla let go of Brad and took a desperate step forward toward the porch. The illusion of her grand matriarch status was completely gone. She looked like a terrified old woman grasping at straws. "Fiona, please," my mother begged, her voice cracking with manufactured hysteria. "Tell them to put the guns down. We are your family. This is just a misunderstanding about paperwork. We can go inside and talk about this over breakfast like civilized people." "There is nothing left to talk about, Mother," I replied, staring down at her with absolute zero empathy. "Yesterday you told me to be a good daughter and sacrifice my life to save Brad's financial mistakes. You told me to face reality. The reality is that your golden child and his slick lawyer just walked into a federal snare. And breakfast is not on the schedule today." As the words left my mouth, the heavy front gates of the estate swung open completely. 4 more black government vehicles rolled onto the property, crunching over the gravel and boxing in my family's luxury cars. Men and women in sharp, dark suits stepped out. They were not wearing tactical gear. They were carrying thick, sealed briefcases bearing the gold emblem of the Internal Revenue Service. Malik took a staggering step backward, his expensive Italian leather shoes slipping on the wet grass. He looked from the armed marshals to the approaching IRS agents, and all the blood drained from his face. His arrogant lawyer persona completely disintegrated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, exposed fraud. "You actually thought a $40 million deficit could be wiped clean by rushing a fraudulent real estate sale?" I asked, stepping down to the first stair of the porch. I looked directly into Malik's panicked eyes. "You thought you could shuffle corporate funds through Apex Holdings, LLC in the Cayman Islands without triggering a federal audit. My grandfather knew exactly what you were doing, Malik. He hired private forensic accountants 2 years ago. I spent all night reviewing the encrypted hard drive he left me in his biometric safe. I have every single wire transfer, every forged signature, and every illegal offshore ledger you created." Brad let out a strangled, gasping sound. He clutched his chest as if he were having a heart attack, staggering away from the tactical agents. "You cannot do this," Brad wheezed, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "I am the acting head of the Campbell family business. I have legal immunity through the corporate bylaws." "You have absolutely nothing, Brad," I stated, my voice ringing with cold, absolute authority. "As of 6 o'clock this morning, the federal government executed a sweeping asset freeze under the RICO Act. Every single bank account tied to your name, Malik's name, and the Wilson Group Trust has been frozen and seized." Amber let out a high-pitched shriek. She frantically pulled her phone from her designer handbag, her perfectly manicured thumbs swiping aggressively across the screen. "No, no, no!" Amber screamed, tapping her banking application repeatedly. "It says my accounts are locked. My platinum cards have a 0 balance. Mom, do something. They locked my trust fund." A female IRS special agent stepped forward, her expression entirely devoid of sympathy. She looked directly at Amber, and then pointed to the sleek luxury sports car parked on the ruined lawn. "Hand over the keys to the Porsche MA," the agent demanded, holding out her hand. "That vehicle was purchased using embezzled corporate funds. It is now federal property." Amber threw a massive, hysterical tantrum, stomping her feet and clutching her designer bag to her chest like a spoiled child. "I am not giving you my car!" Amber wailed, tears of pure selfish rage streaming down her face. "You cannot take my things. I am a Campbell." "Priscilla." My mother looked like she was about to faint. The reality of her vanishing social status hit her harder than a physical blow. She grabbed the collar of her expensive fur coat, her hands shaking violently. "Fiona, please," Priscilla begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "You are ruining us. We will lose the country club. We will lose the penthouse. I will have to file for bankruptcy. You cannot leave your own mother destitute." I stared at the woman who had demanded I sacrifice my entire future just yesterday. I felt a deep, profound satisfaction watching her elitist facade crumble into dust. "You are not destitute, Mother," I replied, my tone completely flat. "You are just experiencing the reality you wanted to force onto me. You chose to protect a thief instead of your own daughter. Now you get to pay his debts." But the financial annihilation was just the appetizer. The true reckoning was about to begin. The heavy oak door behind me opened one more time. Stepping out onto the porch was a tall, distinguished man with silver hair wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit. It was the federal prosecutor from the Eastern District, the man I had spoken to at 2:30 in the morning. He walked up beside me, looking down at Brad and Malik with an expression of absolute lethal disgust. Wire fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion carry extremely heavy federal sentences. The prosecutor began, his voice booming across the driveway. But financial crimes are not the reason the United States Marshal Service deployed a tactical sniper team to this estate today. The remaining color vanished from Brad's face. His knees visibly buckled, and he had to lean against the hood of Malik's SUV to keep from collapsing. Malik started shaking his head back and forth, a low sound of pure animalistic terror escaping his throat. I took a step closer to the edge of the porch, my eyes locking onto my brother. Flight 404. I said the words dropping like heavy stones into the crisp morning air. Brad let out a horrifying guttural sob. He slid down the side of the vehicle and collapsed onto his knees in the wet gravel, clutching his stomach as if he had been physically gutted. I found the offshore ledger, Malik. I continued, my voice rising in volume, carrying the full weight of my absolute fury. I found the $250,000 wire transfer you sent to the lead aviation mechanic exactly 48 hours before my grandfather's jet went down. You did not just steal from this family. You did not just bankrupt the company. You murdered our grandparents in cold blood to cover up your pathetic financial failures. Amber stopped screaming about her car. Priscilla gasped, clamping both hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror as she looked down at her golden child, sobbing in the dirt. Brad Campbell and Malik Jones. The federal prosecutor announced, pulling a thick stack of warrants from his jacket. You are both under arrest for conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, interstate fraud, and federal racketeering. You will be held in federal custody without the possibility of bail. The U.S. Marshal gave a sharp tactical nod. The heavily armed agents moved forward instantly. They did not read them their rights with gentle courtesy. They grabbed Malik by the shoulders, slamming him face first against the side of his own luxury SUV. The violent metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting closed echoed across the driveway. Malik was sobbing uncontrollably, babbling incoherently about making a deal about testifying against Brad. Another agent hauled Brad up from the gravel by the scruff of his expensive suit jacket, pinning his arms behind his back and securing the heavy cuffs around his wrists. Brad was screaming for his mother, crying like a terrified child, begging her to save him. But Priscilla could not save him. She was backing away from her own son, staring at him as if he were a monster, her entire world entirely and permanently destroyed. I stood on the porch of the magnificent estate my grandfather had built, watching the federal agents drag the two murderers toward the waiting government vehicles. The absolute power of the law had descended upon them, crushing their arrogance, their greed, and their lives into nothingness. I took another slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. The predators had been caught, and the Campbell empire was finally safe. The heavy dust kicked up by the departing federal vehicles slowly settled over the crushed stone driveway. The black tactical SUVs carrying Brad and Malik disappeared down the winding mountain road, taking the murderers away to a maximum security federal holding facility. They would never see the outside of a prison cell again. The remaining Internal Revenue Service agents finished tagging Amber's Porsche and the two luxury SUVs with bright yellow asset forfeiture stickers. A female agent handed my mother a single laminated document outlining the total freeze of her personal and corporate accounts before turning on her heel and driving away. The profound absolute silence of Crystal Lake returned. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the water against the wooden docks. I stood on the wraparound porch, lowering my grandfather's ceramic coffee mug. Down on the ruined grass, my mother Priscilla and my sister Amber were left completely stranded. They had arrived with an army of armed mercenaries, expecting to throw me onto the street. Now they were standing in the damp morning chill, stripped of their wealth, their transportation, and their arrogant delusions. I watched my mother closely. For a full minute she stared down the empty driveway where her golden child had just been hauled away for orchestrating the violent deaths of her own parents. I expected her to collapse into genuine catastrophic grief. I expected her to mourn her father and mother. Instead, I watched a terrifying shift occur in her posture. The aristocratic matriarch facade had been shattered, but her parasitic survival instinct immediately took over. Priscilla wiped her dry eyes with her silk handkerchief and slowly turned to face me. She forced her facial muscles into a trembling, pathetic mask of maternal affection. She took a tentative step toward the wooden stairs of the porch, holding her hands out, as if reaching for a long-lost child. The U.S. Marshal, standing a few feet away, immediately stepped forward to block her path, resting his hand on his utility belt. I raised my hand, signaling the Marshal to stand down. I wanted to hear exactly what she was going to say. "Fiona, my sweet, beautiful girl." Priscilla began, her voice vibrating with manufactured sorrow. She let out a dramatic sob, pressing a hand to her chest. I had absolutely no idea. You have to believe me, Fiona. I was completely blinded by them. I never knew Brad and Malik were capable of such monstrous things. I never knew about the offshore accounts or the airplane mechanic. I am a victim of their manipulation just like you are. She took another step closer, her eyes darting past me to look into the warm, luxurious interior of the $15 million estate. We were both too harsh yesterday, she continued, turning on the waterworks with practiced theatrical precision. The grief of losing your grandparents clouded my judgment. I was just so stressed about the company finances. But the truth is, I just miss my daughter. You are the only family I have left now, Fiona. We are Campbell women. We need to stick together. Please let us come inside. Let us sit by the fire and manage this terrible trauma together as a family. We can handle the estate together. I stared down at her, feeling a wave of absolute clinical disgust. She did not shed a single tear for my grandfather's murder. She did not mourn my grandmother. Her entire performance was a calculated, desperate pivot to secure her access to the $100 million empire I now solely controlled. Amber chimed in, completely oblivious to the gravity of the federal murder charges her brother just caught. She stomped her designer shoe on the wet grass, crossing her arms and shivering. "Mom is right, Fiona." Amber whined, her voice carrying its usual grating entitlement. "My phone is completely deactivated. The IRS agent said my platinum cards are declining. This is a nightmare and my shoes are completely ruined from the mud. Just open the door and let me use the guest room Wi-Fi so I can call my friends to come pick us up. It is freezing out here." I looked at Amber, then shifted my gaze back to my mother. My heart rate remained at a steady, resting pace. I felt absolutely no obligation, no guilt, and no pity. "You are not a victim, Mother," I stated, my voice echoing off the stone pillars of the porch, crisp and lethal. "You are an enabler who chose the illusion of wealth over your own flesh and blood. Do not stand on my property and insult my intelligence by pretending you want to manage this trauma together. You do not miss your daughter. You miss your country club membership. You miss your personal driver. You miss the unlimited credit lines that the federal government just vaporized." Priscilla recoiled as if she had been slapped. Her fake tears instantly dried up, replaced by a flash of genuine panic. "Fiona, how can you be so cold?" she gasped, grasping the wooden railing of the stairs. "I am your mother. You cannot leave us out here in the cold. We do not even have a car to get back to the city." I took a slow step forward, looking directly down into her desperate, calculating eyes. "Less than 20 minutes ago, you stood on this exact driveway and ordered armed mercenaries to drag me out of this house by my hair," I reminded her, my tone devoid of all emotion. "You told me to be a good daughter and sacrifice my entire future so your golden boy could survive. You told me to face reality." I gestured out toward the vast, empty expanse of the Campbell estate. "So I am asking you to face reality right now, Mother," I continued. "The reality is that you chose a murderer over me. You chose a corporate thief over my grandfather's legacy. You stood by and cheered while Malik forged legal documents to steal my home. And now you expect me to open my doors and invite you in for coffee." Amber let out a frustrated groan. "Stop lecturing us and just let us inside." "Fiona," Amber complained, wrapping her fur coat tighter around her shoulders. "We are legally your family. You cannot just leave us stranded on a private mountain road." I tilted my head, studying my sister with cold precision. "Actually, Amber, I can," I replied. "And I am. This estate is private property protected by a federal trust. You have exactly 60 seconds to turn around and start walking toward the main highway. It is a 5-mile hike down the mountain, so I suggest you pace yourselves in those designer heels." Priscilla let out a sharp, terrified gasp. "You cannot be serious, Fiona. You are sentencing your own mother to walk down a mountain highway like a common vagrant." "We have no money. We have no phones. What are we supposed to do?" I took a final sip of my coffee, letting the dark roast warm me against the crisp morning air. "I suggest you start being realistic, Mother," I answered, throwing her own vile advice right back into her face. "If you do not liquidate your arrogance right now, you will not make it down the mountain before dark." I turned my back on them and walked toward the heavy oak doors of the villa. The U.S. Marshal stepped forward, placing a firm hand on his radio, making it abundantly clear that if they attempted to step onto the porch, they would be arrested for trespassing on federal ground. I walked inside, pulling the heavy wooden doors shut. The loud, definitive click of the deadbolt locking echoed across the property, serving as the final permanent boundary between me and the toxic bloodline I had just severed forever. I walked into the grand foyer, and the heavy oak doors secured tightly behind me. I expected my mother and sister to finally accept their defeat and begin their humiliating 5-mile trek down the mountain. I walked toward the kitchen to finish my coffee, assuming the morning drama had officially concluded. Instead, the Villa high-tech smart home security system chimed sharply. The exterior camera feed popped up on the digital wall monitor. Priscilla was not walking away. She had marched right back up the steps and was now banging her fists against the reinforced glass of the front door. She had quickly realized that playing the victim was not going to work on me, so she instantly pivoted to a much darker and more sinister strategy. "Fiona, open this door right now!" My mother screamed through the glass, her voice muffled but still carrying a frantic, demanding edge. "You are having a mental breakdown. The grief of losing your grandparents has made you completely delusional. You are not in your right mind. I am your mother, and I am getting you medical help whether you like it or not." I stopped dead in my tracks. A cold, heavy realization settled over me. She was laying the groundwork for an involuntary psychiatric hold. It was a classic aggressive legal maneuver used by wealthy families to strip uncooperative relatives of their autonomy. I set my ceramic coffee mug down on the marble counter. I walked over to the smart home control panel mounted on the wall. I did not open the door. Instead, I activated the exterior surround sound speakers, originally installed by my grandfather, for hosting lavish outdoor summer parties. "You always did love a captive audience, Mother," I said, pressing the intercom button. My voice boomed across the front porch and echoed off the surrounding pine trees, crystal clear and perfectly steady. "Let us see how much you love this one." While reviewing the encrypted hard drive in the biometric safe last night, I had found more than just the offshore banking ledgers and the wire transfers. I had also found a folder of intercepted phone calls recorded by the private forensic accountants my grandfather had hired. One specific audio file was dated just 3 weeks ago. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket, connected it to the Villa Bluetooth system, and selected the file. I did not argue with her fake tears or her fabricated medical concerns. I simply pressed play. The crisp digital audio recording blasted through the outdoor speakers for everyone on the property to hear, including the federal agents still stationed near the gate. My mother's voice echoed across the lawn, cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless. "Fiona is isolated and unstable," Priscilla said on the recording. "She lives alone in New York and rarely speaks to the family. If we file for an emergency conservatorship, can we have her institutionalized?" A smooth, professional male voice answered her. It was a high-priced, shady probate lawyer from Manhattan. "With the right paperwork and a signature from a cooperative psychiatrist, we can place her on a mandatory psychiatric hold," the lawyer explained on the tape. "Once you are granted full medical power of attorney, she is declared legally incompetent. You will assume total control of her assets, including any trusts in her name." Then Amber's high-pitched voice chimed in on the recording, confirming her absolute complicity in the plot. Then we can liquidate the lake house, institutionalize Fiona permanently, and split the cash to cover Brad's corporate debts before anyone notices the money is gone. I stopped the recording. The silence that followed was deafening. Outside on the porch, Priscilla and Amber froze exactly where they stood. The concerned, loving mother act vanished in a single devastating second. The mask completely slipped. They were caught red-handed plotting to strip away my basic human rights, lock me in a psychiatric ward, and steal my inheritance to fund their luxurious lifestyle. The U.S. Marshal standing near the driveway crossed his arms, looking at my mother with absolute, unfiltered disgust. Priscilla's face contorted into pure, unadulterated rage. The wealthy, sophisticated matriarch was entirely gone, replaced by a feral, vicious predator who had just been backed into a corner. "You ungrateful little wretch!" Priscilla shrieked, her voice cracking with venom. She slammed her hands violently against the door glass, her face turning bright red. "That money belongs to the Campbell family. You are nothing but a pathetic appraiser. You have never been one of us. You are a selfish monster. Give us what is ours." Amber joined the meltdown, stomping her ruined designer shoes against the wooden porch boards and screaming obscenities that echoed across the lake. "You stole our inheritance," Amber yelled, pointing a shaking finger at the security camera. "You set Brad up. We are going to destroy your life, Fiona. We will ruin your career and make sure you have nothing left." I watched their violent, hysterical breakdown through the security monitor. They looked utterly pathetic. Stripped of their money, their power, and their leverage, they had nothing left but empty threats and childish tantrums. I stepped up to the door and unlocked the deadbolt. I opened the heavy oak door just a few inches, keeping the heavy steel security chain firmly engaged. Priscilla lunged forward, reaching a desperate hand through the gap, but she was stopped instantly by the thick metal chain. I looked at her terrified, furious face, and I smiled. It was a cold, bright smile of absolute victory. Medical fraud and conspiring to falsely imprison a sane adult for financial gain, I stated clearly, ensuring my voice carried to the federal agents watching from the lawn. That constitutes a massive violation of civil rights and opens up a whole new set of federal conspiracy charges. "You cannot prove anything," Priscilla hissed, her eyes darting wildly. "That recording is illegal." Actually, I corrected her smoothly. "My grandfather hired private investigators to record your calls on corporate devices, which makes it entirely legally admissible in a federal racketeering case. I emailed that specific audio file to the United States Attorney 10 minutes ago. They are adding conservatorship fraud to your expanding list of crimes as we speak." Priscilla opened her mouth to scream another insult, but no sound came out. The absolute reality of her situation had finally crushed the last remaining ounce of her arrogance. "Enjoy your hike down the mountain, Mother," I said, my voice perfectly polite and incredibly sharp. "I will see you both in federal court." I pushed her hand away, shut the heavy oak door, and locked the deadbolt for the final time. I turned my back on their muffled screaming, walking away from the foyer and heading into the quiet, peaceful warmth of my new home. 72 hours later, I traded the peaceful sanctuary of the lake house for the cutthroat arena of Manhattan elite high society. With Brad and Malik currently sitting in federal holding cells awaiting their bail hearings, my grandfather's massive empire was finally free from their parasitic grip. As a senior luxury asset appraiser, I knew exactly how to fortify a trust fund. It was time to aggressively liquidate the hidden physical assets my grandfather had stashed away over the decades. I arranged a highly classified meeting at the Pinnacle Country Club, an ultra-exclusive establishment in the heart of the city where billionaires conducted their business behind closed mahogany doors. The dining room smelled of aged leather and expensive bourbon. I sat across the table from Maxwell Pierce, the lead automotive auctioneer for a premier global auction house. I was wearing a tailored ivory silk suit projecting absolute authority. Maxwell adjusted his reading glasses as he meticulously reviewed the authentication dossier I had provided. My grandfather Charles had been a master of invisible wealth. While reviewing his encrypted hard drive, I had discovered the deed to an abandoned industrial warehouse in upstate New York. When I drove up there and breached a boarded-up false wall, I did not just find an empty garage. I uncovered a pristine automotive time capsule. Wrapped in heavy-duty protective tarps sitting on blocks with their fluids perfectly drained and engines meticulously oiled were three original 1966 Shelby Cobra 427s. "These are immaculate," Maxwell said, his voice hushed with genuine reverence as he traced the original title documents. "The provenance is bulletproof, Fiona. Finding one of these in this condition is a generational miracle. Finding three is unheard of. I can confidently guarantee a minimum of $3 million per vehicle at our next international auction, $9 million total, and that is a conservative estimate." "Excellent," I replied, taking a slow sip of my sparkling water. "I want them moved to your secure vault by midnight. We will bypass the reserve price," and I never finished my sentence. The heavy brass-handled doors of the private dining room were violently shoved open, hitting the wood-paneled wall with a loud, aggressive crash. The serene, sophisticated atmosphere of the country club shattered instantly. My mother, Priscilla, and my sister, Amber, barged into the room. They looked absolutely unhinged. The sleek, polished veneer they usually wore had been completely replaced by frantic, desperate mania. They had somehow managed to survive their humiliating hike down the mountain 3 days ago, but the reality of their frozen bank accounts had clearly driven them into a corner. Following closely behind them was a nervous, sweating man in a cheap, wrinkled suit, clutching a thick manila envelope. "Fiona, my poor, sick darling," Priscilla announced, projecting her voice at maximum volume to ensure the wealthy patrons in the adjacent lounge could hear every single word. She threw her hand dramatically to her forehead, putting on a wildly exaggerated performance of a heartbroken mother. "Please stop this madness. You are not in your right mind." Amber stepped forward, pulling out her smartphone and pointing the camera directly at me. "We are doing this for your own good, Fiona," Amber added, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You need serious psychiatric help. You have locked your own family out, and now you are selling off precious family heirlooms out of sheer mania." The nervous man in the cheap suit stepped up to the mahogany table. He completely ignored the multi-million-dollar Shelby Cobra authentication documents scattered across the surface. He slapped the thick manila envelope down right next to my crystal water glass. "Fiona Campbell, you have been officially served," he stated quickly, taking a massive step backward as if he expected me to physically attack him. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not give my mother the satisfaction of a panicked reaction. I calmly picked up the envelope, broke the seal, and pulled out the legal filing. It was exactly what I had anticipated they would try. A petition for involuntary conservatorship. It was signed by the exact same shady probate lawyer whose voice I had captured on the audio trap. They were legally declaring me a danger to myself and attempting to seize full medical and financial power of attorney to strip me of my inheritance. I slowly set the document back down on the table. I smoothed out the sleeves of my ivory suit and looked directly at the auctioneer. "I apologize for the unruly audience, Maxwell," I said, my voice perfectly steady and dripping with refined elegance. "Wealth often breeds a very specific type of desperate theater when the funds dry up. Please ignore them." Maxwell blinked, clearly shocked by my ironclad composure. He nodded slowly, leaning back in his leather chair and watching the spectacle unfold with clinical fascination. "You cannot ignore this!" Priscilla shrieked, her theatrical facade slipping as her genuine rage boiled to the surface. "You are having a severe psychotic break. The court has been petitioned. You have no legal authority to sell those cars. Everything you own is going to be placed under my direct control until you are mentally rehabilitated." I interlaced my fingers, resting them on the table. I looked at my mother with a smile so cold it could have frozen the room. "You really are a slow learner, Mother," I stated, my voice cutting through her screaming like a razor blade. "Did you honestly think I just played that audio recording on the porch for my own entertainment? I warned you that I emailed that file to the United States Attorney." Amber lowered her phone slightly, her fake sympathetic expression faltering. "What does that have to do with the conservatorship?" Amber snapped. "It has everything to do with it," I replied, tapping the signature line on the petition. The shady lawyer who drafted this fraudulent document for you was arrested by the FBI at 6 o'clock this morning. He is currently sitting in an interrogation room, singing like a canary about your grand plan to falsely imprison a sane adult for financial gain. This petition is not a legal binding document. It is a signed confession of conspiracy. Priscilla's jaw dropped. All the color drained from her face, leaving her looking gray and hollow. The process server realized he had just handed me evidence of a federal crime. He turned around and sprinted out of the dining room without saying another word. Furthermore, I continued, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper. You are currently trespassing in one of the most exclusive private clubs in Manhattan, while under active investigation by the Internal Revenue Service. You do not have the membership status to be in this building, and you certainly do not have the funds to pay for the damages if I decide to sue you for public harassment. Right on cue, two massive club security directors in dark suits appeared in the doorway. They did not ask politely. They grabbed Priscilla and Amber by their arms. "Get your hands off me!" Priscilla shrieked frantically, struggling against the security guard. "I am a Campbell. I belong here." "You belong in a holding cell, mother," I corrected her, taking another sip of my water. "And if you ever attempt to ambush me in public again, I will personally make sure the prosecutor upgrades your charges." Amber screamed wildly, dropping her phone as the guards dragged them backward out of the dining room. Their humiliating shrieks faded down the elegant hallway, leaving the private room in absolute silence once again. I turned my attention back to the auctioneer smoothly adjusting the Shelby authentication files. Now, as I was saying Maxwell, I continued, my voice completely unbothered. "We will bypass the reserve price and list all three vehicles at the prime evening slot. Do we have a deal?" Maxwell extended his hand across the table and we shook on the agreement. The Shelby Cobras were officially heading to the auction block, and the Campbell family empire was securely funded. But as I walked out of the Pinnacle Country Club, leaving the lingering chaos of my mother's humiliating exit behind me, I knew the war was not entirely over. Priscilla was a desperate, cornered animal. Even with her shady probate lawyer sitting in federal custody, she would inevitably try to find another corrupt attorney or file a pro-se petition to challenge my mental competency. I needed to ensure that any future attempt to declare me legally unfit was dead on arrival. I signaled my driver and headed straight to the financial district. My destination was the high-security office of Mr. Winston Caldwell, a veteran commercial and estate lawyer who possessed a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in a courtroom. I had retained his services the moment I realized the depth of Brad and Malik's financial crimes. Mr. Caldwell was a man who did not believe in defensive legal strategies. He believed in total, overwhelming preemptive strikes. I stepped into his corner office, dropping my leather briefcase onto his massive glass desk. Mr. Caldwell looked up from his paperwork, his sharp eyes missing nothing. "They attempted the ambush," I stated, taking a seat opposite him. "Priscilla and Amber brought a process server to the country club. They tried to publicly serve me with a petition for involuntary conservatorship. I informed them their lawyer had already been arrested by the FBI, but we cannot leave anything to chance. Priscilla will keep trying to claim I am delusional to get her hands on the estate." Mr. Caldwell folded his hands, resting his chin on his knuckles. "Involuntary conservatorships are notoriously difficult to fight if the family controls the narrative," he explained, his voice gravelly and serious. "They rely on creating a paper trail of alleged erratic behavior. We are not going to wait for a judge to review her fraudulent claims. We are going to build an airtight medical and financial defense that makes it entirely impossible for any court in the United States to question your cognitive function." He handed me a piece of paper with 3 names printed on it. "These are 3 of the most rigorous board-certified forensic psychiatrists in the state of New York," Mr. Caldwell instructed. "You are going to willingly subject yourself to 3 separate independent psychological evaluations over the next 48 hours. We will preemptively crush their mental instability claim before it ever reaches a courtroom docket." I did not hesitate. I spent the next 2 days sitting in sterile clinical offices, enduring hours of intense psychological profiling. I was subjected to extensive cognitive assessments, behavioral history reviews, and complex logic puzzles designed to detect even the slightest hint of mania or cognitive decline. I answered every single question with the surgical cold precision of a senior asset appraiser. I detailed my business operations, my management of the $100 million Campbell Trust, and my exact legal strategies for handling my family's hostile takeover attempt. The results were unanimous and completely devastating to my mother's fabricated narrative. All three top-tier psychiatrists signed heavily documented affidavits, confirming that I was not only in perfect mental health, but possessed an exceptionally high-functioning analytical mind. One doctor specifically noted in his official report that my emotional regulation under extreme familial stress was remarkably superior to the average adult. I was officially bulletproof. I returned to Mr. Caldwell's office the following afternoon, dropping the 3 sealed medical affidavits onto his desk. He reviewed the signatures with a satisfied nod before pulling out a thick stack of banking ledgers. "The medical defense is secured," Mr. Caldwell said, sliding a specific financial document toward me. "Now we destroy their financial leverage. I have been auditing the origin of the capital you used to purchase the abandoned industrial warehouse upstate. The exact location where you found the Shelby Cobras." I looked down at the highlighted bank statement. The purchase price of that desolate rusted property had been exactly $150,000. It was an investment I had made years ago, relying purely on my professional instincts when I noticed the local zoning laws in that county were about to shift. "Your mother has been claiming to anyone who will listen that you used misappropriated family funds to make that purchase." Mr. Caldwell continued tapping his pen against the ledger. "She plans to argue that the warehouse and the multi-million-dollar classic cars inside it belong to the Wilson Group portfolio because you allegedly used corporate money to buy the deed." I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "I never touched a single cent of corporate money," I replied, my voice dripping with absolute disdain. "When I refused to let them control my career path, they cut me off entirely. I bought that warehouse using my own private funds." Mr. Caldwell smiled, a cold, predatory expression that mirrored my own. "I know," he stated, pulling a secondary document from his file, "and I have the irrefutable banking evidence to prove it. But what I found during the audit is far more damning for your mother." He slid a heavily redacted wire transfer log across the glass desk. I studied the routing numbers and the timestamp. The $150,000 I had used was not just random savings. It was a direct life insurance payout from my late grandmother Beatrice, explicitly designated for my continuing education and housing. "Look at the blocked transaction code at the bottom of the page," Mr. Caldwell instructed. My eyes darted to the red-flagged error code. 7 years ago, just days after the life insurance policy was dispersed, there was an unauthorized attempt to wire the entire $150,000 out of my private account. The destination routing number belonged to a dummy trust controlled exclusively by Priscilla and Brad. A fresh wave of absolute disgust washed over me. My mother and my golden child brother had tried to embezzle my grandmother's life insurance payout right out from under me while I was struggling to pay my student loans. I had caught the fraudulent transfer, locked down my bank account, and immediately used the secured funds to purchase the commercial warehouse deed to keep the money safe from their greedy hands. "They tried to steal my safety net," I whispered, my grip tightening on the edge of the glass desk. "They tried to leave me with absolutely nothing and funnel my grandmother's final gift into their own corrupt accounts." "Exactly," Mr. Caldwell confirmed, leaning back in his chair. "You did not just make a brilliant real estate investment, Fiona. You successfully protected your own inheritance from a documented embezzlement attempt by your mother. This banking evidence proves 2 things simultaneously. First, that every single asset inside that warehouse belongs 100% to you. Second, that Priscilla Campbell has a documented history of attempting to defraud her own daughter." I stared at the wire transfer log, feeling a profound sense of lethal clarity. My mother had spent her entire life painting me as the unstable financial burden of the Campbell family. She had paraded around high society, claiming she was the responsible matriarch trying to manage a deeply troubled daughter. Compile the medical affidavits and the life insurance wire fraud logs into a single public court filing. I ordered Mr. Caldwell, my voice ringing with unwavering authority. I want this submitted to the probate judge, the federal prosecutor, and every single social club board member my mother has ever lied to. We are not just defending my assets anymore. We are going to permanently dismantle her entire existence. While my legal team was busy fortifying my assets and filing the devastating banking evidence with the probate court, my mother, Priscilla, was running out of options. Her golden child, Brad, and her favored son-in-law, Malik, were sitting in federal holding cells, facing life sentences for conspiracy and murder. Her platinum credit cards were declining across Manhattan, and her social circle was rapidly treating her like a highly contagious disease. Desperation breeds a very specific type of venom, and Priscilla decided to aim her remaining poison at the easiest target she could find. My youngest sister Daphne had always been the quiet, compliant shadow of the Campbell family. Unlike Amber, who craved the spotlight and actively participated in the cruelty, Daphne simply tried to survive by remaining invisible. She had married Isaiah, a brilliant and grounded African-American architect who ran his own independent firm in Brooklyn. For years, Isaiah had silently endured my mother's elitist snobbery and subtle racist microaggressions. Priscilla had never considered architectural design a real profession fit for the Campbell bloodline, constantly comparing him to Malik's high-powered legal status or Brad's hedge fund illusion. Isaiah had swallowed the disrespect purely out of love for Daphne, acting as her anchor in a sea of familial toxicity. But Priscilla's desperation had finally crossed a line that Isaiah refused to tolerate. Locked inside the study of her leased Upper East Side townhouse, Priscilla shoved a thick legal affidavit across the polished mahogany desk. Daphne sat trembling in the leather guest chair, her eyes wide with anxiety. The document was a fabricated medical testimony. It required Daphne to swear under penalty of perjury that I had a lifelong history of severe manic episodes, violent outbursts, and paranoid delusions. Priscilla needed a blood relative to corroborate the fraudulent conservatorship petition she was desperately trying to force through the courts. "Sign the paper, Daphne," my mother demanded, her voice sharp and frantic. She paced behind the desk, her hands shaking as she clutched a glass of expensive wine she could no longer afford. "Your sister has completely lost her mind. She is hoarding $100 million estate while your brother rots in a federal penitentiary. You are going to sign this affidavit right now so we can present a unified family front to the judge. Once we establish her mental incompetence, we can seize the trust, liquidate the assets, and hire the best defense attorneys in the country to get Brad out of prison." Daphne looked down at the pen resting on top of the document. A tear slipped down her cheek. "But Mom, it is a lie," Daphne whispered, her voice trembling. "Fiona is not crazy. She never had manic episodes, and Brad did terrible things. I saw the news. I cannot lie to a federal judge." Priscilla slammed her wineglass down on the desk so hard the stem nearly snapped. "You ungrateful, cowardly little girl," my mother hissed, leaning over the desk to glare directly into Daphne's tear-filled eyes. "You will do exactly as I say. Brad is your brother. He is blood. Fiona is a treacherous monster who orchestrated this entire nightmare to steal what belongs to us. You pick up that pen and you sign your name, or I swear to God I will cut you out of this family forever." The heavy wooden door of the study swung open before Daphne could reach for the pen. Isaiah stepped into the room, his broad shoulders instantly altering the power dynamic of the space. He had been standing in the hallway listening to the entire abusive exchange. He did not yell or raise his voice. He simply reached into the pocket of his tailored suit jacket, pressed the record button on his phone, and let it capture every single word of the confrontation. "Daphne is not signing anything," Isaiah stated, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that commanded absolute respect. He walked directly to the desk and pulled the pen away from his wife's trembling hands. "You are asking her to commit perjury to cover up a murder plot orchestrated by your son. That ends right now, Priscilla." My mother whipped her head around to face him, her eyes blazing with unhinged fury. "Excuse me," she sneered, her aristocratic facade entirely replaced by venomous entitlement. "This is a private family matter. You are just the husband. You have absolutely no say in how the Campbell family conducts its business. Step back and let my daughter do her duty. Isaiah did not move a single inch. He stood between Priscilla and Daphne, placing a protective hand on his wife's shoulder. Your family business is currently being dismantled by the FBI and the IRS. He replied, his tone perfectly calm and devastatingly precise. You are not protecting a legacy, Priscilla. You are sinking a ship, and you are trying to drag Daphne down to the bottom of the ocean with you. I will not allow it. Stand up, Daphne. We are leaving. Daphne sniffled and began to rise from her chair, gaining strength from her husband's unwavering support. The sight of her youngest daughter slipping from her control pushed Priscilla over the edge into absolute madness. If you walk out that door, I will destroy you, Priscilla shrieked, pointing a shaking finger directly at Isaiah's chest. Do you hear me? I still have friends on the City Planning Commission. I still know the developers who fund your pathetic little architecture firm. If you do not sit down, shut your mouth, and make your wife sign that affidavit, I will personally ensure your business is blacklisted across the entire state of New York. I will ruin your career, Isaiah. You will never design a single building in this city again. You will be bankrupt by the end of the quarter. The threat was vicious, calculated, and entirely illegal. It was also exactly what Isaiah had been waiting for. He looked at my mother with an expression of profound clinical pity. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, tapping the screen to stop the audio recording. The digital chime echoed loudly in the tense silence of the study. Did you just record me? Priscilla gasped, the color rapidly draining from her face as she realized what had just happened. I just recorded you attempting to coerce a witness to commit perjury while simultaneously threatening to destroy my business through malicious interference, Isaiah confirmed, slipping the phone safely back into his pocket. You have spent years looking down on me, Priscilla. You made racist remarks about my background, you belittled my profession, and you treated me like a second-class citizen in your home. I stayed quiet because I loved your daughter, and I wanted to keep the peace. But you just crossed a line into federal extortion. Isaiah took Daphne's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. You do not have any power left, Priscilla. Your money is frozen, your golden child is a murderer, and your friends are not going to return your calls when they hear this audio file. We are done here. He turned his back on my mother and guided Daphne out of the study. Priscilla collapsed into the leather desk chair, her hands covering her face, as the reality of her total isolation crashed down upon her. She had tried to use her youngest daughter as a pawn, and instead, she had handed the prosecution another piece of irrefutable evidence. 10 minutes later, my cell phone buzzed in my office. It was an encrypted audio file sent directly from Isaiah, along with a brief text message. He wrote the message simply: Daphne is safe. We are officially out. Use this to bury her. I pressed play on the audio file, listening to my mother's unhinged threats of extortion and perjury. A cold, satisfied smile spread across my face. Priscilla had just hammered the final nail into her own coffin. The digital chime of the audio file, finishing its playback, echoed in the absolute silence of my home office. I stared at my phone, processing the sheer magnitude of the gift Isaiah had just handed me. My mother had just committed federal extortion on tape. Before I could forward the file to my legal team, my phone vibrated with an encrypted message. It was Isaiah again, requesting a face-to-face meeting immediately. He specified that it had to be a secure location, free from any potential surveillance. I sent him the address to Mr. Caldwell's law firm in the financial district. Within the hour, I was sitting in the familiar glass-walled conference room. Mr. Caldwell stood by the window, reviewing the audio file I had already forwarded to his secure server. The heavy oak doors opened, and Isaiah stepped inside. He looked exhausted. The polished, confident posture he usually maintained was weighed down by the heavy toll of protecting his wife from her own toxic bloodline. But his eyes were sharp and completely focused. I stood up and extended my hand. Thank you, Isaiah, I said, my voice filled with genuine respect. You did not just protect Daphne today. You handed us the exact ammunition we need to permanently neutralize Priscilla. Isaiah shook my hand firmly, taking a seat across the glass desk. "Daphne is my priority," he stated, his baritone voice steady and resolute. "I have watched your mother tear you down for years, Fiona. I kept quiet to keep the peace for my wife. But threatening my business and attempting to force Daphne into committing perjury was the absolute limit. I am done playing the compliant son-in-law." Mr. Caldwell took his seat, folding his hands over a pristine legal pad. "The audio recording of the extortion threat is flawless," Mr. Caldwell confirmed. "We will file it with the federal prosecutor this afternoon. It proves Priscilla Campbell is actively attempting to fabricate medical testimony to unlawfully seize your assets. But I sense you did not ask for a secure meeting just to hand over an audio file we already received." Isaiah nodded, reaching into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a small black encrypted flash drive and placed it exactly in the center of the glass table. "You are right," Isaiah said, leaning forward. "The audio proves Priscilla is desperate. But this drive proves exactly why she is desperate. It is not just about the frozen corporate accounts or maintaining her country club lifestyle. There is a much darker deadline hanging over their heads." I frowned, staring at the small black drive. "What did you find, Isaiah?" 2 months ago, Priscilla hosted a mandatory family dinner at the townhouse, Isaiah explained. Brad was completely unhinged that night. He was sweating, drinking heavily, and pacing the hallways. He excused himself to the private study and locked the door. Later that evening, I went to the study to retrieve Daphne's coat. Brad had left in a hurry, but he forgot to close his laptop. The screen was awake, and a highly encrypted dark web messaging forum was open. As an architect, I am trained to notice microscopic details. I saw the numbers, and I saw the threats. I took out my phone and photographed every single screen before he returned. Mr. Caldwell picked up the flash drive and plugged it directly into his secure offline terminal. He typed in a rapid sequence of commands to scan the drive before projecting the images onto the large monitor on the conference room wall. The screen illuminated with dozens of high-resolution photographs of Brad's private laptop. They were not corporate ledgers or standard banking statements. They were offshore cryptocurrency wallets heavily tied to a notorious underground gambling syndicate based out of Eastern Europe. I stared at the screen, my blood running completely cold. Brad had not just lost $40 million of the family trust in incompetent hedge fund investments. He had been actively trying to win the money back through illegal high-stakes crypto gambling rings. And he had failed catastrophically. "Look at the final ledger balance," Isaiah instructed, pointing to a specific photograph showing a direct messaging thread. The message was not written in standard legal terms. It was a brutal, violent threat from a syndicate enforcer. Brad owed them exactly $2 million in personal gambling debts. The message clearly stated that if the $2 million was not transferred by the end of the month, the syndicate would send a collection team to New York to extract the payment in blood. "He owes a violent criminal cartel $2 million, I whispered, the horrifying reality sinking in. The corporate embezzlement was Malik's strategy to cover the trust deficit. But this is Brad's personal death warrant." "Exactly," Isaiah confirmed, his expression grim. "Priscilla knows about this debt. I overheard her screaming at Brad about it in the garage weeks ago." "The conservatorship petition is not just corporate greed, Fiona. It is a desperate, frantic ransom attempt. Priscilla knows Brad is sitting in a federal holding cell right now. The syndicate can easily reach him in prison. She needs clean, liquid, unmonitored cash to pay off the cartel before they execute her golden boy. She is trying to declare you mentally unfit so she can liquidate your assets and use your money to buy her son's life." Mr. Caldwell let out a sharp breath, leaning back in his leather chair. "This changes the entire legal landscape," Mr. Caldwell stated, his eyes narrowing with predatory calculation. "Priscilla is not acting out of financial preservation. She is acting out of lethal desperation. A desperate, cornered animal will break every law in the book to survive. She will not stop at a fake medical affidavit. She will hire corrupt doctors, she will forge court documents, and she might even attempt to hire physical muscle to intimidate you." I looked at the threatening messages on the screen, feeling a surge of absolute ironclad resolve. My mother was willing to lock me in a psychiatric ward, and strip away my basic human rights just to pay off her golden child's gambling debts to a violent cartel. She viewed my life as nothing more than a bargaining chip to save a murderer. Print every single one of those syndicate messages I ordered Mr. Caldwell, my voice devoid of any hesitation. Attach them to the audio file Isaiah provided. I want a comprehensive dossier delivered to the federal prosecutor and the judge handling the probate case. We are going to expose the exact reason she is filing this fraudulent conservatorship. I turned to Isaiah, meeting his steady gaze. You need to take Daphne and leave the city immediately, I advised him. Once Priscilla realizes you handed this over to the federal government, she will direct all her venom at your firm. Go to your property in upstate New York and stay off the grid until the federal marshals secure her arrest. Isaiah nodded, standing up from the glass table. We are leaving tonight, he confirmed, buttoning his suit jacket. Daphne is finally ready to cut the cord completely. Be careful, Fiona. Priscilla has absolutely nothing left to lose. I watched him walk out of the conference room, grateful for the secret alliance that had just shifted the balance of power entirely in my favor. I turned back to the glowing monitor, looking at the violent threats directed at my brother. My family had dug their own graves, and I was fully prepared to push them in. 3 days after discovering the syndicate threats, my family had dug their own graves, and I was fully prepared to push them in. The heavy mahogany doors of the Manhattan probate court swung shut with a definitive thud, sealing us inside the sterile, windowless room. I sat beside Mr. Caldwell at the respondent table, wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit. My posture was absolute iron. I did not fidget. I did not adjust my cuffs. I stared straight ahead with the clinical detachment of an executioner waiting for the drop. Across the center aisle, my mother Priscilla sat with her new legal counsel. Since her previous high-priced attorney was currently sitting in a federal holding cell facing extortion charges, she had been forced to scrape the bottom of the legal barrel. Her new lawyer, a sweating, anxious man named Mr. Higgins, nervously arranged his files. Priscilla had entirely abandoned her usual flashy designer wardrobe. She wore a conservative, pale beige dress with minimal makeup, attempting to project the image of a humble, exhausted mother rather than a status-obsessed socialite. Judge Harrison, a stern, no-nonsense magistrate with decades of experience presiding over bitter family wealth disputes, slammed his gavel to open the hearing. The petition for involuntary conservatorship was officially underway. Higgins stood up, buttoning his cheap suit jacket, and approached the podium. He launched into a meticulously rehearsed opening statement designed to paint me as a deeply disturbed individual suffering from a severe psychotic break. Higgins claimed that the sudden tragic death of my grandparents had triggered a latent manic episode. He spun a wild narrative about me locking my loving family out of the estate, engaging in paranoid delusions about federal snipers, and completely detaching from reality. But the absolute centerpiece of his argument, the so-called undeniable proof of my severe financial incompetence, was my real estate portfolio. Your Honor, Higgins stated, his voice dripping with manufactured concern. We have obtained financial records showing that Ms. Campbell recently liquidated $150,000 of personal savings to purchase a desolate, environmentally hazardous warehouse in upstate New York. It is essentially a toxic dump with a collapsed roof and zero commercial value. A sane, rational individual, functioning with a healthy cognitive baseline, does not throw away their life savings on a rotting industrial shell. She is burning through capital at an alarming rate, and if this court does not intervene and grant her mother immediate financial power of attorney, Ms. Campbell will bankrupt herself before the end of the year. I did not react. I did not roll my eyes or scoff at his ridiculous claims. Inside, I was smiling a cold, lethal smile. Higgins and my mother had absolutely no idea that the toxic dump they were using as their primary evidence of my insanity was currently holding $9 million worth of pristine original Shelby Cobras. They were handing me the exact ammunition I needed to publicly humiliate them on the court record. Higgins called Priscilla to the witness stand. My mother walked slowly, placing her hand on the wooden railing, as if she could barely support her own weight. She took the oath, and sat down, pulling a plain white tissue from her pocket. The performance that followed was nothing short of an Oscar-worthy theatrical masterpiece. Priscilla looked directly at the judge, her eyes brimming with fresh, convincing tears. She spoke with a trembling, fragile voice, weaving a tragic tale of a desperate mother trying to save her severely unhinged child. She lied under oath with the ease of someone who had spent her entire life manipulating reality to fit her selfish needs. "I love my daughter, Your Honor," Priscilla wept, dabbing the corners of her eyes delicately to avoid ruining her mascara. "I have tried everything to help her, but ever since my father passed away, Fiona has become a completely different person. She is erratic. She is hostile. She surrounds herself with armed guards and refuses to let her own flesh and blood comfort her. I watched her stand on the porch of our family home and scream at empty trees. She is suffering so deeply and she refuses to seek psychiatric care." Priscilla let out a heartbreaking sob, gripping the edges of the witness stand. "I do not care about the money. I do not care about the estate. I just want my little girl safe and sound. I need the legal authority to check her into a proper residential treatment facility where she can get the intensive medical help she desperately requires before she hurts herself." The courtroom was dead silent, allowing the echo of my mother's fake sobbing to fill the air. It was a brilliant performance. A lesser judge might have been swayed by the sheer emotional gravity she projected, but I did not break my ironclad composure. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the polished wooden table. Next to me, Mr. Caldwell leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his legs, and looking at Priscilla with an expression of mild amusement. "We let her cry. We let Higgins build his entire case on the foundation of my supposed manic financial ruin and violent paranoia. They were digging their hole deeper and deeper, making sure there was absolutely no way to climb out once the truth was revealed." I glanced at the thick, sealed leather briefcase resting at Mr. Caldwell's feet. Inside that briefcase were the 3 independent psychiatric evaluations, proving my flawless cognitive function. Inside that briefcase was the authenticated auction appraisal for the Shelby Cobras, proving my absolute financial genius. And most importantly, inside that briefcase was the audio file of Priscilla explicitly detailing her extortion plot, alongside the terrifying syndicate threats against Brad. Priscilla finished her tearful monologue, wiping her nose and looking at me with a gaze full of fake maternal sorrow. She thought she had won. She believed she had successfully manipulated the legal system into handing her the keys to my empire and the funds to save her murderous golden child. The judge turned his attention to our table, expecting a frantic, desperate defense from a cornered, unstable woman. Instead, I simply adjusted my collar and gave Mr. Caldwell a microscopic nod. It was our turn to speak. Mr. Caldwell buttoned his suit jacket with a slow, deliberate motion. He stood up from our table, projecting the kind of